Do you know what's there? Waiting, beyond that beach. Immortality! Take it! It's yours!
The early 2000s was the golden age for fantasy and medieval epics in Hollywood. Because during this time, studios cranked out hit after hit, movies that were unlike anything audiences had ever seen before. And at the time, it would have sounded unbelievable to think that in a short 20 years, we'd never see films like these again. It really was a golden age, and it ended abruptly somewhere in the early 20-teens. But why did this happen? Why does all fantasy today both look too clean and feel too produced? And why does it all feel empty and hollow? When by contrast, films made 20 years ago, with less technology and smaller budgets, still outshine modern attempts at the same genre and themes? The answer might surprise you, or it might not. Enter the golden era. To understand why fantasy and adventure back in the day was so good, we need to understand the climate that gave rise to these genres in Hollywood. The late 90s and early 2000s created a unique cultural backdrop for the golden age of fantasy and adventure in Western cinema. The Cold War had just ended, the economy was booming, and suburban life felt secure and prosperous in comparison to the existential threat of nuclear holocaust that loomed over the world in the 1980s. And in the 90s and early 2000s, it seemed like the world was collectively breathing a sigh of relief as the Cold War era came to an end. And this sense of a safer world and brighter tomorrow seeped into media. The Simpsons was the most popular cartoon on TV, which depicted 35-year-old buffoon Homer Simpson who provided for his family of 5 on a single salary at a job he was barely good at. And this reflected much of society in the West. Jobs were plentiful, pay was fair, the economy was strong, building a stable life was achievable for most. And the idea of heading to the movies to enjoy the spectacle of a world on the brink of destruction that could only be saved by honorable heroes was just what middle-class America wanted to do on the weekends. And this created an environment where fantasy and adventure could flourish. But this was only part of the formula of success. At the time, in Hollywood, very little intellectual property existed in the fantasy and adventure space. But with the release of films like Braveheart, Last of the Mohicans, and then the big cultural shift, The Lord of the Rings, and Harry Potter, executives saw the doorway to these genres beginning to open. And because there were no existing successful franchises to reskin or revisit, studios and executives took the risk of hiring directors to bring these genres to life from scratch. And they gave them almost full creative control and autonomy, something that would change drastically 2 decades later. Now, this cultural and economic backdrop, combined with practical effects and young but capable CGI capabilities that were starting to come online, meant that stakes were high and budgets were expensive, but potential rewards were even higher. So studios, writers, and directors were extremely careful with their films. They planned obsessively prior to filming, with multiple versions of scripts, storyboarding, plans for how to achieve practical or CGI effects, because at the time, budgets and logistics for these giant epic fantasy and adventure films meant that these filmmakers and studios had 1 or maybe 2 chances to get big, expensive scenes right during filming. And since adventure and fantasy IP didn't exist in the way it does now, stories were pulled from history and from literature, and only the best directors were trusted to bring these stories and characters to the big screen. Legends like Peter Jackson, Wolfgang Petersen, and Ridley Scott were granted full autonomy and creative freedom, which gave birth to some of the greatest films in fantasy and adventure of all time. But it wasn't just the culture, the directors, practical effects, or source material that made films in fantasy and adventure better back in the day. Because back then, stories and screenplays themselves were actually written by people who knew how to tell a story. Why were stories better in the early 2000s and late 90s? Kids today don't realize what life was like before social media. But millennials will remember that back in the day, art, music, culture, and entertainment in all forms followed a different rule of law pre-2010. Whatever an artist's medium was back then, art was created to bring a vision to life and make an impact on the world. But today, everything is created for algorithms, including this video, unfortunately. If you don't serve the algorithm, people won't see your art. So you need to think about the algorithm on the platform you're posting to first and work backwards from there. And slowly but surely, because of this, art becomes less about art and more about serving the algorithm. But during the golden age of fantasy, studios, writers, and directors had the luxury of structuring their stories around themes that didn't need to consider the trend-focused algorithms that exist today. Nobody back then was thinking about writing a story that YouTubers and TikTokers would start commenting on and creating content around. Using controversy as an advertising tactic wasn't a thing. Writers and studios back then could focus on the product, not on the distribution channels that needed to be served in order for their film to be successful at release. Which meant that more stories followed traditional 3-act structures with a focus on character building, moral arcs, and the human experience at the forefront. And this is why in the 90s and early 2000s, characters felt like they had so much depth. It's how we got characters that we fell in love with, like Frodo, Sam, Aragorn, William Wallace, General Maximus, Hector and Achilles from Troy. And it's also worth noting that since these stories were original, or the first time they had been retold on the big screen, dialogue for these characters was actually meaningful. There wasn't any prior work to reference through fan service or Easter eggs or lousy lame cameos, because the only goal with these films was to make a good movie that had a soul and made audiences feel something. But the abandonment of all of these values isn't what killed these genres. Yes, they were factors, but the real straw that broke the camel's back was actually the success that films in these genres enjoyed for almost 2 decades. Here's how and why things deteriorated. There are a number of things that contributed to the deterioration of the fantasy and adventure genre in film from 2010 on to the current era. First, there was the financial collapse in 2008, which marked the end of an almost 2-decade period of prosperity, and all of this happened at the same time that growing social media platforms were coming online, taking market share for screen time away from Hollywood studios. So what's a Hollywood executive to do in such an environment where dollars are harder to come by, there's more competition for attention, and audiences are made up of people who live in a society that doesn't feel as safe as it used to? Hollywood wound up doing what all venture capital and multi-billion-dollar industries do, something that I call the Chipotle effect, which deserves a small side quest to explain. Chipotle Mexican Grill was founded in Denver, Colorado in 1993, right around the same time that the birth of the golden era of fantasy and adventure happened, though the two are unrelated. But it's interesting that they happened in the same time period because their success reflects society and what was important at the time. Anyway, Chipotle exploded in popularity for 3 reasons: great prices, massive portions, and fresh ingredients. And this simple formula resulted in continued growth until Chipotle went public in 2006. And as is the story with anything successful enough to go public or be acquired by venture capital, the demands for infinite profits placed on the company by Wall Street quarter after quarter meant that Chipotle, in order to keep making money without having to invest in innovation, left them with 3 options: either drive up prices, or reduce quality and portions, or start swapping fresh ingredients for who knows what, as long as it's cheaper. And Chipotle did all 3 of these things, which led to massive backlash in 2022 and 2023 when people were sick of it.
Chipotle Are Chipotle's burrito bowls really getting smaller? Customers have been recording themselves ordering food in hopes that employees might feel a little bit of pressure to give them a larger portion. Bowl size may vary depending on the ingredients.
And the same thing happened to fantasy and adventure in Hollywood. As the global economy slowed and studio executives found themselves sitting on insanely valuable intellectual property from the last 2 decades, they decided to loot the treasuries of good faith that they had built with their audiences and fans. Fewer new worlds and stories were explored, and instead we got reboots or sequels that nobody wanted, because these sequels and reboots came at the sacrifice of the original stories that they were built on. But it wasn't just cannibalization of intellectual property. The temptation of relying too heavily on CGI and just fixing things in post-production replaced the careful planning and attention to detail on set that created all of the convincing worlds and interactions that we experienced in the best films of the early 2000s and late 90s. And this crutch of digital VFX made every film start to look and feel the same, which is a real shame, because some of the best movies in fantasy and adventure of all time are still good today, even though they don't even have the greatest effects or visual. Films like The Princess Bride, The Dark Crystal, Braveheart, and even Lady Hawk. These films still entertain and make you feel something today. So it wasn't just the reboots, the sequels, or an over-reliance on visual effects that killed the golden age of adventure and fantasy in cinema. It's something much more lazy and stupid. As studios chased profit, what made these genres magical began to fade. What really killed the golden age of fantasy and adventure was the emotional tone shift away from good stories and an attempt to expand existing brands and intellectual property through new releases and films. This happens when a studio cannibalizes existing IP to make a story more palatable to more people across all demographics of all ages. And this is done so that studios can theoretically make more money on future releases. And while on paper this might sound good to investors and executives, it's actually the fastest way to kill a brand or a franchise. It's the Chipotle problem. And the pitch sounds something like this. You know, we can increase our profits if we just decrease the portions by 10% and raise prices by 5%. And if we use slightly cheaper ingredients, our overall profit margins will increase by 20%. We'll make a lot more money. And on paper, it seems like that would work. But that assumes that people won't notice that they're getting something different for their money. Because in reality, when a company does this, no matter what the product is, it just winds up ruining the thing that true fans love, the very things that made the product popular in the first place. And often, what results is a new product, which is something that nobody wants. Now, there are always going to be die-hard fans who will accept every change along the way. But I don't really understand the people who once experienced peak cinema or peak Chipotle burritos and keep accepting worse and worse versions over time, pretending like things aren't getting worse. A prime example of this, pun intended, is for the Lord of the Rings franchise. The original Lord of the Rings trilogy was absolute cinema. The Hobbit wasn't that great, and Rings of Power was absolute trash. Now, objectively, maybe the Rings of Power is okay, but compared to the original thing that we got, which was the Lord of the Rings, it's not even close to the same thing. And this is because with each iteration, creators tried to reskin intellectual property, retell old stories, and market it to broader and more general audiences to make more money. Here's an example. If you look at the original Lord of the Rings trilogy, it's hard to make the argument that it was ever made for kids, because it just wasn't. It was gritty, it was heavy, at times it was dark, but it was equally beautiful and inspiring and hopeful. Two sides of one coin. Triumph in these films felt like something because of all of the suffering and sacrifice that characters that we came to love had to go through leading up to the film's conclusion. Characters felt real, decisions and events carried weight, and no amount of rewatches of this trilogy ever makes these movies hit less hard than they did the first time you watched them. then came The Hobbit. There are entire video essays on why The Hobbit failed to revisit the same Middle-earth that we experienced in The Lord of the Rings, so I won't go into that in this video. But what The Hobbit did do, which didn't help its case, was try to revisit all of the old themes and tropes that studios thought were the reasons The Lord of the Rings was so popular. And granted, the themes in The Lord of the Rings did work with audience, but it's because they were subtle and well thought through, which made them believable. But The Hobbit inflated all of the wrong storytelling elements and themes from The Lord of the Rings and failed to focus on the things that mattered, the core story and the character arcs of the hero's journey. And what I'm about to point out to you, once you see it, you'll never be able to unsee it, because it happens in every single sequel and franchise extension without fail. I call it the carbon copy effect. Let's look at this in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. In The Lord of the Rings, there's a theme of an heir to the throne who rises from obscurity to greatness. And The Hobbit does the same thing with Thorin Oakenshield. In The Lord of the Rings, we have this forbidden love story between two lovers of different races who can never be together. The Hobbit does the same thing with whoever this dwarf is and whatever this elf's name is. The Lord of the Rings shows how elves are just built different and are among the greatest warriors of all time. And The Hobbit does this on steroids, to a point that makes scenes like this laughable instead of interesting and awe-inspiring. And speaking of awe-inspiring, The Lord of the Rings has some of the most epic and large-scale massive battles of all time. And so does The Hobbit, but let's make the battles bigger and make them last longer. It's like these studios are shouting, "Remember the Battle of Helm's Deep? Well, here's an even bigger battle. You love battles. Remember Grima Wormtongue? Well, here's Grima Wormtongue's cousin." And all of this is made worse because everything is diluted to become kid-friendly, so that the whole family can enjoy these films and have a laugh. Only these decisions wind up ruining franchises, and they ruined fantasy and adventure, because these genres aren't built on themes or ideas that are appropriate for all ages. Fantasy and adventure is about moral choice, sacrifice, good versus evil, and existential threats. But in order to make more money, studios have to fluff up these themes so that everybody will buy a ticket and nobody will feel uncomfortable while watching these films. Pirates of the Caribbean did this, each sequel becoming more absurd and soulless than the last, with plots and characters being ruined along the way. Captain Jack Sparrow went from being subtly hilarious to obnoxious and over the top. The subtle banter and tension between Legolas and Gimli gave way to horrible lines exchanged between whatever that dwarf's name is and whatever this elf's name is. Nemiriel, Glamariel, whatever. Why can't we remember their names? It's because corporate profit chasing killed the franchise. We don't really care about this story. And that's why everything feels so flat today. Studios now only make fantasy and adventure on existing IP. Nothing new is created, and new releases reskin what was once familiar and loved and turn it into a caricature of itself that's impossible to connect with. Because that's what big executives and shareholders think you need to do in order to sell more merch and more tickets. The fantasy and adventure golden age didn't end because audiences changed it. It fell apart because studios destroyed what audiences once loved in a chase for money. The older films we all love were handmade miracles crafted by people who loved the source material and felt honored to have a hand in bringing it to life. Today, everything is created with the broadest, most diverse audience possible in mind. And that's why this genre stopped hitting. And I don't know if it's going to ever come back, because the issue isn't about money or budgets available to these stories and directors and studios. Game of Thrones is a prime example of a series that got worse as budgets and resources increased. And that's because character arcs and human experiences are actually really hard to write and get right. It's so much easier just to retell the same old story over and over with a different veneer or facade on the outside. Just make it bigger, louder, funnier. And I think that's what it comes down to. The issue isn't about resources or lack of talent within Hollywood. It's about time. Studios want higher volume of releases every single year. And rather than spending the time to craft something new, it's easier to reskin something old and get it out quickly, relying on the intellectual property to sell tickets rather than on the merits of the film itself. So the question is, How does this get fixed? Because despite all of the slop that Hollywood is producing in the fantasy and adventure space, there's arguably never been a more important time in history for new stories within these genres to be told. The trick is, these stories just need to be told by people and artists who actually care about stories and characters. People who aren't obsessed with the money on the other side of the finished product. So I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Whether or not you agree with this analysis, factors that I may have missed that contributed to the decline in these genres, or maybe you're a forever optimist and you like the movies coming out in this space. Anything, I'm interested in hearing everyone's thoughts on what needs to happen to bring about a second golden age for fantasy and adventure. Let me know what you think.